I've been trying to play with this idea of like the essence of God's time. Like the moments of synchronicity require timing as opposed to time. And what's interesting is time is a noun, but timing is a verb. And like the essence of synchronicity is the internal environment matching the timing of a external phenomenon where you get that immediate feeling of meaning, of almost like divine meaning. And so I've been playing with this perspective of when I feel an urge to do something novel, just go do it and see what happens. And the interesting thing is it seems to generate more synchronicity.
Welcome back to the Mind Meld, my friends. It is almost impossible to believe that this is the first pod I've posted with Erick Godsey on this platform, because the man is more than just a regular. He is a true wonder brother. But for the uninitiated, budding YouTube-only audience, Erick is a truly wonderful, whimsical, wise being beyond his years. He has incredible knowledge. He's an incredibly deep autodidactic diver on some of my favorite topics: psychology, myth, philosophy. He is widely experienced in visionary states. I guess everybody's definition of widely experienced varies, but if you ask me, pretty experienced. He's a writer, he's a podcaster, he hosts the show The Myths That Make Us, which I think is just such a fabulous name for a podcast. I came up with the name. But anyway, in this one, we muse mercurially about way too many topics to name, but I will name a few. The brilliance of the late great mythopoetic psychiatrist Carl Jung, mental health, habit change, how to skillfully navigate the snake pit that is modern spirituality, why visionary experiences are so valuable in our quest to make sense of our minds, our lives, and the world at large, and just so much more. So I will stop there. For all on Godsey, links are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops, including if you want to initiate yourself into our Patreon community, you'll find that link there as well. And with that, let's dip in to this mind meld. We're in the space now to face the pressure of defining the space, of making the space mean something. That's kind of a funny motivation, isn't it? Or a funny thing that I think a lot of people feel pressure to in general is, I got to make this about something. I can't just be here. I can't just follow the Ram Dass adage. I got to make something of this shit. And that's kind of a lot of pressure on a being.
Yeah, what's interesting is I've had the opportunity to practice it over and over and over again, to trust that there is something in me that is fundamentally intelligent, that if I just listen to what it wants to ask and what it wants to say, what happens is dope. So there is no pressure.
Yeah. I was getting very meta with that assertion in general, like how we, not just within the confines of this podcast, but within the confines of life. Maybe some people don't feel that pressure, or maybe some people don't even think about the why of it all. But I feel like I've been pretty consumed by that all the way back.
Yeah, I think if we're honest with ourselves and we pay attention, we'll notice that every day it oscillates between that and the antithesis of that. So like when you're in a really good conversation, or when you're working out, or when you're on a walk, or when a song is just fucking good, you're not in that space. But then there's the in-between spaces where it absolutely does come up. And I think also just honoring where you're at in your life. Like you did something huge recently, which is you quit your job, and so I think that there is, given that we live in the capitalistic container that we do live in, it's like you got to figure it out to a certain degree so you don't have to worry about, core things like rent and shit like that. But it oscillates.
This is true. This is very true. And maybe that's my problem is I spend too much time in the liminal spaces. And I think that that is definitely true about me. Like I spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm going to do to a detriment. You know, like there's definitely a point where you're like, yo, thinking about what you're going to do is not the thing. Doing the thing is the thing. And yeah, that's definitely a problem for me. What's your biggest sort of psychic demon that you're regularly finding yourself doing battle with?
Yeah, mine is, and this is actually something that in just the last 2 weeks, I've been actively, finally, finding myself starting to improve it. And my psychic demon is actually the overdevelopment of the part of me that's able to produce meaningful work to the point where really what I know that I'm doing is I'm coping with this faint sense of workaholism, where it's like the way that I justify how much awesome shit goes on in my life is through, working like 10 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
And also for me personally, because I have had a history with chronic pain, that I
Oh
actually
yeah.
retreat into my mind and quote unquote do meaningful work as a way to actually disassociate from my body. And so what I've been doing the last few weeks is reading fiction has actually been a big like practice for me. And then also going on long walks instead of trying to force myself to work. Like if I don't have 2 4-hour periods each day of deep work where I don't feel like I'm meaningfully
Yeah.
grinding, if I'm unconscious, I start to feel shame and guilt.
Same, dude. Same.
And I've been really called to a couple of things, actually. One is walking. And that video that you posted was actually really inspiring. So I just want to say thank you for that, where you went on that 12-hour walk. But the other thing that I've been playing with is this sense of if you want to call the consciousness that is kind of dominating Western culture, that's like destroying our ecology and producing a lot of traumatized people as quote unquote empire consciousness. I've been playing with this idea where there's like empire time, which is
Mm-hmm.
like our 24-hour, like we divide the year into 4 financial quarters as opposed to 4 seasons. And the goal of each quarter is to produce more value than the previous quarter with this implied goal of infinite growth. And the only thing in nature that infinitely grows without finding equilibrium with its environment is cancer. That I've been trying to play with this idea of like the essence of God's time, like the moments of synchronicity require timing as opposed to time. And what's interesting is
Mm.
time is a noun, but timing is a verb. And like the essence of synchronicity is the internal environment matching the timing of a
Yeah. Yeah.
external
Yeah. Yeah.
phenomenon where you get that immediate feeling of meaning, of almost like divine meaning. Whereas time is a noun, and it's actually the antithesis of what time actually is because time is a verb. And so I've been playing with this perspective of when I feel an urge to do something novel, just go do it and see what happens. And the interesting thing is, it seems to generate more synchronicity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I've just been doing for the last 2 weeks. Like a few days ago, it was like a Wednesday. And I saw that I had like 6 hours on my calendar where I didn't have anything that I had to do. How I would normally treat that time is I'd be like, okay, I'm going to do a 4-hour deep work sprint where I don't do anything other than work for 4 hours. But instead, I read fiction. in the middle of the week, in the middle of a work day. And I don't think I've actually ever done that since I started working like 10 years ago.
Well, I can tell you we're different in that respect because, man, when I was still working, I was fucking off at every possible opportunity, basically. I was like, yeah, I won't even get fully into it. But I think the difference is obviously what you're doing also overlaps with your personal passion, and you
Yes.
get a lot of leash to really put yourself into it and
Yeah.
really sculpt it into something that matters to you personally. So there's a huge difference there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm resonating a lot with what you're saying about feeling like you need to have those deep work sessions in the day, or else the day's not worth anything, or else you feel guilt, whatever little smorgasbord of negative self-critical emotions. And I'm with you on that. And I think the popular thing to say is that, like, is like, give yourself a break, like, be easier on yourself, it's okay. But then there's part of me that's like, maybe this is the Jordan Peterson or like fucking Goggins part. It's like, no, you should be working towards something, god damn it, like. and 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 I think that that's the less popular
Oh
thing to
man.
say, but also is very valid. Like, if you're not using your time and your mind and your ability to create mindfully, what the fuck are you doing? Like, that is a fair point. But I guess really what it comes down to is balance and finding the tension. Because I'm always playing with little things to post, and I think the problem with being too much in those structured deep work sessions is that you're too in the, what would be called, like, the Apollonian mind. You're too deep
Yeah.
into that part of the mind, that the trickstery part, the creative part, the Dionysian part doesn't get to play that equal role. And I think something that I wound up sculpting has something along the lines of like, progress is the tension between play and structure, or something like that.
Yep.
And you need that playful part for the structure to have maximal effect. But I don't think there's a way in culture popularly that people understand how to balance those. Like when you get too deep into the structure, like what do you do? I don't think a lot of people know the answer to that question, and they just go deeper into the structure, or they do something that's really not productive to, like, cut loose, or like, you know go to a happy hour or whatever, which I'm
Mhm.
not saying is a bad thing. But
No, yeah, the metaphor in my mind that really alchemizes the potential confusion is a mixture of the metaphors of an orchestra and then also tracking an animal. And that the
hmm,
orchestra metaphor, the first thing it does is it brings in the frame of music, and that it also brings in the frame that you are not an individual. You're a multitude of characters. And the two characters that you just brought forth as a joke are actually very insightful, that we're all a collection of characters. And I think, like, if you'll grant me the idea of each of us has a dharma, that our dharma is the song that wants to come through the composer, but that the essence of good music is not to play the same tune the whole time, because that's boring as fuck. And that, like, listening to your, like, instinctive intelligence will give you an insight about whether or not a change is needed. Like, I know what it feels like to make myself work because I feel I ought to,
mhm.
And that there are times in my life where, because of the agreements I've made with either coworkers or friends or with myself, that I choose to do deep work even when I don't want to. And that's when I bring in that David Goggins type of consciousness. But then I can also feel when I retreat into my work to avoid things in my life that make me emotionally uncomfortable. Like a really clear example is if I don't want to confront the fact that the current pattern of eating that I'm in actively makes me feel shame, but I
Yeah.
ignore it, I'll read more. Or if I notice that I'm avoiding an uncomfortable conversation with my partner or with a coworker or with a friend, I'll retreat into working.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's about like listening to when you're bullshitting yourself. I really think is the core of this. And this is why I'm so big on journaling. And it's that if you don't have a intentional practice where you have almost like a inner cloister where you can start to be honest with yourself, if you don't have that, you're bullshitting yourself. Like it is the nature of human momentum to bullshit ourselves unless we cultivate a practice to like call ourselves out to ourselves.
Yeah.
And the Jungian part of me is like, when I journal, I will often talk to the different parts of me. And I like imagine that there's like a council of characters around a table. And like I'm actively asking the parts that I can feel are trying to like steal the throne. I'll have them talk to me.
Mm.
And so like,
Stealing the throne. That's great, dude. That's really great. Yeah.
yeah, there's the M. Night Shyamalan movie Split, I
Mm-hmm.
think actually is a really good metaphor for parts work, where it's like whichever one of his inner characters is quote unquote in the light is the one that gets to act out through the body. And I actually think that that's psychologically true in a profound way. And just to give people a specific example, I've given a name to the part of myself that is gluttonous as a way to cope with pain. Because when I was in college and I tore my rotator cuff and I got surgery, I then got addicted to painkillers. And then I started to overeat and I gained like 40 pounds of fat when I was in high school. And that part of me I call, his name is Garrick, for gluttonous Eric.
Mm.
And I actually had a conversation with him about 2 weeks ago that actually started me on this process of choosing new behaviors. But he basically said to the king, the reason I take the throne is because you make plans, but then don't create any structure for those plans to become. And what has happened in the past is that when you do that, we feel shame. And so I actually step in to protect the like young boy in us because you're being irresponsible
Hmm.
as the king. And so then, that insight came from like 3 minutes of writing. And it helped me have like compassion that like if I'm going to make these grand proclamations to myself to like change the way I eat or change the way I work out, I owe it to the child in me who would feel shame at failing by
Yeah.
creating some structure.
Totally. One of the things that just came to mind when you were talking about journaling is that we often, lump what we're doing here talking in with writing because they're both part of language. But what you're talking about, that capacity to be both internal and external at the same time, I think that only comes from writing. And that's like a different psychotechnology almost.
100%.
Like I don't know if Vervaeke coined the term psychotechnology, but that's how I know about it.
Same.
And when you and I was talking about this in the intro to my last pod that I put out, but I'll just to recap it. A psychotechnology is essentially it's like a tool in our psychological kit that we use to navigate the world. And the most common example are things like language, things like meditation, spiritual techniques, cultural milieu, whatever. And language is like one. But I actually think writing should almost be its own psychotechnology, because it's the experience of writing is very, very different than the experience of speaking. It's
Yep.
like there's something meditative about writing that yields a totally different effect. Like, it has this way of organizing your thoughts and telling you what you really think about something. Like, if you like, I can talk in circles and be like, I don't know what I think about this. What do you think about this? And then I leave the conversation, maybe still not sure. But writing will force you. It's like you're either putting it on the page or you're not. You're putting it on the
Yeah.
page or you're not. And that is very, it's a very useful way to not only explore your mind, but to come, like, if you're struggling to come to a decision, I think that might be the best way.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is really important for people to appreciate is one of our most fundamental human drives is to co-regulate with the nervous system and the reality tunnel of our caretakers. And
Mm.
our caretakers have pain, have grief, have shame, have anger, have fear, they have trauma. And whatever their specific coping mechanisms and behaviors and personality, we learn to adapt to that real quickly. And a function of adapting to that for all of us is to learn how to suppress parts of us that we have learned aren't allowed in that relationship if we want to co regulate with them. And that most of us, almost all of us, most of the time, we are managing people's perception of us through partial truths, through withholding, at times outright lying, lying by omission, all these things. And so when you're talking to people, there is this, for most people, most of the time, there's this almost imperceivable sense of anxiety that is actually
Mm.
driving you to bullshit yourself at least a little bit. But what journaling can do is that that's the place where you can begin to cultivate the bravery to admit things in your life that you're not ready to admit to people in person because you fear that if you did, you might be exiled. And that, like, a really stark example for me is before I started journaling when I was like 21, I was in a relationship for 3 years. And it was only through journaling where I realized that I abandoned her emotionally like a year and a half into that relationship. And that I was too caught up in my own momentum of partial truths to admit it to her. And I hurt her. But it was because I didn't have any place in my life where I cultivated trying to tell myself the truth. And then the other big part that I realized is that I wasn't a good friend to any of my friends because I didn't trust any of my friends. And so I wasn't actually authentic with any of my friends. And that I realized that I didn't like being around almost any of them. And it
Mm.
was because we were friends, because we shared some of the same coping behaviors. And once I realized I wanted to stop doing those coping behaviors, I didn't want to hang out with them.
Yeah.
And that if you don't have a practice to cultivate being true to yourself, you're probably in a orchestra of relationships where every instrument that is tuned to you is actually out of tune because they're trying to regulate to something that is out of tune with itself.
Really well put. Really well put. Yeah, and the thing too about that analogy, to just keep stretching the metaphor, is like, some of those instruments you don't have total control over, because what they're doing is dependent on like some exogenous force, right? Like, if you're playing a certain tune on the fucking ukulele, you might be playing that tune because an outside force requires that tune, but then it reflects back in. It has like a kind of ripple effect on the entire orchestra. And sitting down and writing, like we've been talking about, to explore the self, explore the things in your life, make changes, whatever it is, that gives you an opportunity to realize those kinds of things. Realize, oh, the reason I'm playing this tune is because this person gets super defensive anytime I bring that up. So how do I alter that and respond to that in a way that's healthy for me and them? Or do I need to just shut this instrument down and fucking stop? Whatever the case may be. But like, to use your word again, the only way you can do that is if you cloister yourself, is if you really get in touch with what's going on in your own mind and in your own life and do something about it, like at least with yourself, so that then you can fully be prepared for whatever you need to do in an outward facing way. I think that's a really good point, man. And
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and that one of the things that I want to just call out real quickly is that it's not like, okay, well, I need to stop all the forward momentum in my life and take months and heal all the things, blah, blah, blah. No, it's like brushing your teeth. Or it's like if you are trying to cultivate a garden in your backyard, the nature of nature is that if you don't tend to it consistently, weeds will grow in and will start to rob the nutrients from the flowers. The existence of weeds is not proof that the year of work that you've done on the garden was actually a lie. Like a lot of people have that spiritual disposition where if anything comes up again, I've actually deceived myself and I haven't done any of the work, and then they feel shame and guilt. And it's like, no, you're okay. The nature of your psyche is like a piece of land, and that it needs tending. And so just like 20 minutes a day of just honestly writing to yourself is a profound act. It's not something where you have to pause your entire life and go into a cabin and work out all the traumas from your past.
I know obviously journaling has been a practice for you and you have courses on journaling. Do you also meditate, or is journaling your primary introspective practice?
I meditate, but not as consistently as I know that I would like. And actually, a part of this phase that I'm in is cultivating a deeper relationship with that practice. What I have found is that most people in Western culture are so in the mind that journaling is actually like the easier first step, but that ultimately you would want to get to a point where you do practice meditation. My dream life for myself would be whenever I'm between meaningful tasks, instead of going on Instagram or going on Twitter or, just like plopping down and watching YouTube or Netflix, I have the self-compassion and the awareness to just go sit on my cushion, close my eyes, and just for like 10 minutes, just feel into what is the next right action that is meaningful and good. There's a part of me, like, I did a journey with ketamine and cannabis about a week ago, and I had just this really clear, like, insight. And it's when I learn to sit, I'll know exactly what to do. And there's this felt sense of momentum that, like, it's just so easy to, in the same way when you try to sit and you try to keep your awareness on your breath, and then you've realized after 8 minutes that you have forgotten what you were even doing and that you've just been caught up in thinking about a thing after a thing, and then you realize, oh, I'm here to keep my awareness on my breath. That as a microcosm, what I've noticed in my life is I can go days and be in that same type of thing where I'm just and I'm like, what am I even doing?
Oh yeah.
Like, one of the things that I'm
so
struggling.
Real quick, I'm so glad you said that, because I think a lot of people listening to this might think like, oh, Eric probably doesn't deal with that. Or Michael probably doesn't deal with that. Like, we fucking deal with that.
100%.
We fucking deal with that.
And that, like, one of the things that I'm appreciating is that I've reached a quote unquote level of success where there are multiple things that I want to do that would help people, that would feel meaningful to me, and that I also have the relationships and the opportunities for it to be truly incredible, but that I'm not doing any of them because I don't know which one is the right one. And that, like, in just like the last two generations, humans who quote unquote become successful in the way that I have are facing a problem that almost no humans have ever had to face. And it's that you don't have to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Yeah.
But there's this like existential, like, how it feels for me is it feels like shame. Like, I recognize the incredible privilege that I live with. And that, I think a lot of people like are politically triggered by that word and completely won't allow that to even come in. But I'm not one of those people. And like, I want to use my privilege to truly help. And I really see that there's a lot of big, genuine problems in the world, and that I'm actively trying to figure out, how do I aim when I could aim at 20 things, and that
Totally.
there's 100 things to aim at.
Yeah, I'm dealing with a lot of the same issues right now, man. Like being on the other side of having a day job where you just have this open-endedness. And we may have talked about this before, that you think you want relative freedom, like this kind of relative freedom that we're talking about, which again is a huge privilege to have. But then when you get in there, there's this like weird self what's it called, like it's an auto, like it's almost like an autoimmune disorder of the mind, where like the freedom eats itself in a way that makes it feel like it's not valuable. Like you start to feel like, no, this is not this is not good because I'm not accomplishing anything. And then you get into this like weird cyclical cycle of self punishment that feels almost like the mind starts to like eat itself or like rebel against itself because it has this freedom. And maybe there's a way to just exist in that freedom and enjoy it and appreciate it, and not carry it so seriously.
Yeah.
But I don't have that. I don't have that ability. And there's always some creeping worry. And there's always like, and then there's guilt, like you were talking about before, feeling like, well, if you're not doing something that is forward momentum producing with this time, you're not using this time correctly. Like you should be making, you should be doing, you should be whatever. And I don't know if there's a right answer for that, but I think the only thing that balms that up is again to have a certain amount of structure in your day, or it's just not. I can't make it go away if I don't have some amount of structure. But then too, like this point that you're making, this larger point of not knowing where to put that energy when you have so many options. Like even if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, oh, these are fucking, champagne problems. This is fucking ridiculous. I'm in a job. I have kids. Like, if you really zoom out, you would realize that you, to an extent, have this same thing, because there's like free time in your day, or there's time at work, or there's time with your kids, or there's whatever it is, where you're facing this exact same situation where you don't know like where to direct that energy. And that's a difficult piece of decision making, of like using that sort of judgment to be like, I am doing this, I am not doing this.
Yeah.
That's a skill for sure.
The thing that has been deeply inspiring to me has I listened to Rick Rubin's podcast on Joe Rogan's a
I heard
couple
it.
of weeks ago.
Yeah.
That deeply shifted me, and is actually the thing that has brought me into this like current, what feels like a transitory initiatory block in my life, where it feels like I'm actively figuring out what type of initiation to give to myself to transition from individual adult male into husband and father. It feels like that's because I'm recently engaged, and I can feel that like uh, my family life is on the horizon. And that what I got from Rick Rubin's podcast with Joe Rogan was that Rick Rubin's entire life is oriented towards him listening to his gut
Mm.
and doing what feels cool or
Yep.
dope.
Yep.
And that what I have what I have found in just the last like 2.5 weeks is by stepping out of my workaholism and trusting my gut. And so what my gut has been asking me to do is like go on more walks in nature, read fiction, check Instagram and shit much less frequently. Is that what has organically happened in the last 2 weeks is this intrinsic, organic, creative surge to write this article that I'm currently working on. And now I have a thing that I feel drawn towards to do the deep work. And I feel my inner aliveness more intensely than I have in the last couple of months, actually. Like what's really interesting is there's this idea that what if the penultimate compass for what to do is to actually trust what brings you into full aliveness, and that whatever it is that brings you into full aliveness is fundamentally good and is fundamentally intelligent, and that anything that inhibits your full aliveness is not the way.
Mm.
There's a part of me that hates that, because there's a part of me that like has learned to worship like the strict taskmaster. There's a part of me that has learned to worship like, no, I'm gonna ride this horse until it fucking passes out type of like feeling. And I think people might misunderstand what David Goggins and people like him are trying to teach, where it's like you have to do the shit you hate. But I actually think if we could step inside David Goggins' consciousness, he feels fully alive when he's in pain.
Mm.
And that, like, for him, the way life has honed his nervous system, that's what helps him feel fully alive. And that uh, by stepping out of the taskmaster consciousness and just allowing myself to relax for just a week, I have felt this surge of inspiration to create an article where I'm actually trying to, like, the most popular thing I've written probably to date is an article called What is Trauma? And that I focused on acute PTSD in that article. And I've always wanted to write an article over complex PTSD.
Mm.
And, it's been like a year since I wrote the first one. And it always felt like it was half of a whole. And through just relaxing and going a little bit slower, I can feel that out of all the things that I want to create, this is the thing that wants to be created now.
Mm.
And so I've started to work on that. And like just today, like I know that I'm in the flow of my life when I walk into an empty room and I just like either yell because I'm super pumped up, or I like flex my whole body in the mirror like I'm a Dragon Ball Z character. That's actually a very intimate share. It's something that I feel kind of embarrassed to even share, but I know that I'm fully alive when I do shit like that. And I
Oh,
haven't
yeah.
done shit like that in months, and I can feel that I'm back in that, and it feels so good.
We share that, man. I walk around the house just saying bullshit like lyrics to like, for whatever reason, a demon has been in my mind ever since I could speak, to just sing the melody to a popular song and just turn all the lyrics into something filthy and
Yep.
stupid. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, just making noises and being an absolute. If you just peeked in on me somehow, you'd think I was a fucking nutcase walking around the house. But yeah, I mean, yeah, that sort of just unleashed human spirit is a fun thing to wield. The highly caffeinated, highly stimulated, just excitement to play with the knobs and levers of your own mouth and brain is always fun. My favorite feeling is surprising yourself with saying something so fucking dumb that it makes you laugh. Like
Yes.
that's a special human quality. That
Yeah, and
that
I think
that needs its own name, whatever that is.
100%. And I think like what's really important for anyone listening is like one of the great pleasures of life is to become super intimate with the unconscious aspects of you, where it's almost like you're discovering your inner orchestra. And if you can learn to catch and appreciate the little things that you do that let you know I am so alive right now,
Yeah.
that like those are things to track, and that when there's an absence of those things, those are also like hints. I really think that having an inner orientation to the animal that you are, where you're actively trying to like develop that animal so that it can be fully alive, is it's truly
Mm.
one of the great pleasures of life. And that in order to do that, you will be brought face to face with, there's this idea from a spiritual teacher where he says that we each have a shameplex, in the same way that Jung used the word complex, which is
Mm-hmm.
like a inner like constellation of energies that make up like a mental illness.
Yeah.
um, he says that we have a shameplex, and I'm playing around with the frame that we also have a griefplex, and like that is our unique constellation of experiences that generated shame in us.
Mm-hmm.
And shame fundamentally is the thing that inhibits our full aliveness. Like when you have the urge to authentically cry, first off, most people don't cry. And if you don't cry, like that's an illness.
Yeah.
Like we are meant to cry. It's one of the fundamental ways that we like cleanse our somatic body. So most people don't cry. But the people who do cry, most of them will hide their face, or they'll apologize profusely, or they'll contort their face in a pained expression because you can feel that they're trying to stop it. And that's just one example of many, of like we have a unique history of ways
Yeah.
that we suppress our full aliveness. And in order to unlock our full aliveness, we're going to have to face our unique history of shame, our unique history of grief,
Yeah.
but it's worth it.
It is. It is. But it's also, I think, if you're fully in touch, see, here's something where maybe we diverge a little bit here, because although in theory I fully agree with what you're saying, I also think that if you think of your own human animal in that way that you're talking about, how would you ideally train and optimize the life of your pet? Like, you wouldn't let your pet run wild, right? With its
100%.
you wouldn't let it just like, I'm alive right now and I think I want to hump. So you can't
Mm-hmm.
just like start humping everywhere. You can't be like, I got the urge to come right now, so give me 1 second. I'm gonna just, like, you can't come at the mall. You
Yep.
just can't come at the
Yeah.
mall. And
So
and and I know that's not what you're saying. I know that's not what you're saying. But
it's a good question, and it's something that needs to be clarified. And I think I think the pet is a good metaphor to use. And if you imagine a dog, as far as I understand from what I've read and from people who train dogs, a dog will be fundamentally anxious if it is not clear that its owner is the lead animal. And that most dogs that have behavioral issues have them because it's either clear to them that they're the one who controls or that it oscillates. And that the most well behaved dog that I've ever met, her owner was a hunter and would hunt with her.
Mm-hmm.
And she learned through the raw experience of hunting how to be led. But that through her being led, she is the most well-behaved dog that I've ever met when we're inside of a home. And then I have friends who have dogs where it's like they're squeamish about having like all right, so I don't think it's a coincidence that the word that's used for like repressed sexuality is kinks, because I think that those are where we have like
Oh,
shame
interesting.
knots
Yeah,
that keep
interesting.
us from fully expressing our aliveness. And that what has organically grown in like the kink community is that in order to explore these spaces, you first have to have extremely clear rules before you quote unquote start to play. And that often it requires a Dom and then a person who will be led by the Dom.
Yeah.
And that the Dom has to have a certain amount of gravitas in order for the container to be held. And that if they don't have it, it can be re-traumatizing. But like some of the books that I've read about this type of stuff is that if the container is held strongly, it can actually help heal trauma. And that I think that when it comes to the animal in us, it absolutely wants to be led. But in order for it to be led, it has to trust your power. It has to trust you as a leader.
Interesting.
And so you have to almost prove to it that it can trust you. And so then I think that's actually where like, all right, I do what I say I'm going to do. And if we have to do this, you're coming along with me. But then like also a part of the kink container is aftercare. And so like I really think, this is the first time I've ever linked trying to hone your inner animal with like kink stuff, but that like aftercare would be okay if I just made you sit here for 4 hours and do what I wanted you to do and we worked on this article, I'm going to take you on a walk. I'm going to feed you healthy food. Like every so often.
It's funny because we're mixing the metaphors of pet and a sexual partner. So I'm like also imagining the sexual partner being like, and now I'm gonna take you for a walk and I'm gonna give you good food.
Bruh, there are people out here who want to be treated like pets, and that
I'm sure there are.
if people like people on the outside would think that it's a trauma thing, but like I know some deeply spiritually developed people who are some of the kindest and sweetest humans I know, and that they want to be treated like a pet when they have sex with the people that they do that shit with.
Yeah, they're good little doggies. um yeah, man. It's funny because now we're getting into, obviously that I'm one of my go-to lenses for looking at the world is Platonism. And his idea of the soul is that one part of the soul is the animal part of the soul. And that part of the soul really is, and you might push against this, but I'm just trying to summarize what his stance was as well as I can. And it's that is the lowest part of the soul in terms of the hierarchy. And that part of the soul needs to be really ruled over, like almost like a pet, like we've been talking about, but it needs to be the lowest part of the self in the interest of the psyche, and that the psyche, I'm forgetting the Greek terminology, unfortunately, but yeah, the more that we can associate ourselves with the mind, not in like the popular way that we think of the mind, but in the like, imagine the essence of the mind in the clearest possible, the clearest,
Yeah.
cleanest possible way. And the reason that is because the animal pollutes, the desires of the animal pollutes that clarity. So our drives for sex, our drives to dominate, our drives to do the behaviors that we see animals doing, ultimately dirties what a human being is capable of. And again, I guess we have to get into, from the Platonic point of view, what is a human being capable of? Human being is capable of approaching divinity with the mind if it's clean. But if it's not clean, you have no business approaching.
Yeah.
Is sort of the Platonic
Yeah, so
point of view.
there's a few things here that I think are really interesting to zoom in on. One is, I think the uniquely Western notion that up is divine, like higher is divine and lower is not. And I think it is a reflection of what the Greek ideas, one of the ways that they've unfolded in Western culture is that it's led to the domination of animals so that they're like our slaves so that we can do agriculture, that then eventually leads to um, a religious view that sees the animal nature as quote unquote unclean. But I think if you take a step back and you look at reality from the perspective of like from the view of the goddess, that to be lower is to actually be more divine, that divinity comes from the earth,
Yeah.
that the most important part of the tree are the roots, and that shit and piss and blood and decay is actually what regenerates the ground so that more plants and fruits can grow. And that there has been a historical amputation of the earthly part of us, almost like we're trying to escape it because we're afraid of it, because we're afraid of death. We're afraid of rot and shit and piss and fuck. And that if you don't attach a hierarchy to it, and you see that we're like a multi-layered organism, the roots are required to generate the tree that eventually generates the fruit. And so, like connecting to the animal and treating it like it's a root system is what will actually allow you to have the body that can generate the type of energy that is able to power the mind in a way where you can use that mind to help.
Mm-hmm,
I think a lot of people in Western culture, especially the spiritual, like the people who we remember in history as kind of like the top spiritual people, I think that there's been like a fundamental denial of their roots, of their animal nature, because of this deeply rooted shame and
mm-hmm.
guilt and fear that comes from how strong the urges of the animal are. And so to get back to your first question, when I brought up this like frame of listening to your animal desires, is that feel, I think the way to be is do what you have to do to feel fully what the animal desires. And then a part of being a mature adult is that you bring that into resonance with your tribe
Mm-hmm.
and with your culture so that your full animal aliveness can be like herded towards doing meaningful and good things, but from a place of full aliveness.
Yeah. Really, really, really beautifully said. And I think that this is why we also resonate so much with Jung, because he really squared that circle and brought it together. And I don't want to
100%.
say that Plato didn't, because I don't want to speak for him more than I really have the ability to.
Right.
And
What I actually think happened real quick is I think a lot of what Plato taught got reframed through the Gnostic fear of the demiurge and this like denial of the body as like a fundamental lie to try to overcome. And that my deep intuition is that if we got to sit down with Plato, he would clear a lot of our misunderstandings up about his work and his teachings.
I think you would too, especially because as you and I both know, that he was plugged into this sort of, see, the thing when we say goddess, I don't want people to think of like the Instagram depiction of
No.
the neo new age idea of this, because he was at Eleusis drinking the kykeon that brought communion with the goddess. So I think
Yeah.
we have to divorce our idea that we know what this is from his perspective. But I'm also curious how he would square these things, because they were, I mean, the goddesses were earth goddesses, right?
Yeah.
Like the goddess from Eleusis, we're obviously talking about Persephone, Demeter, and these are the earth goddesses. So there was that distinction. But anyway, we're just sort of tangentially
That's what we
getting
do,
off.
dog.
Yeah, I know. But to get back to the sort of larger kind of heart of this conversation, we've been talking a lot about just in general getting a grip on the mind, and then also doing practices that I guess really help you do that. And the reason I think you and I are both so centrally concerned with that is because we don't feel like we were given, I mean, I know from previous conversations that you would probably agree with me here, that we
Yeah.
don't feel like we were brought up with any way to do
No.
that. It was just sort of like follow the well-worn path and it'll fucking just work out. And this is why so I'm such a defender of this idea that we require a spiritual element of our lives, and that we require spiritual purpose in our lives. But I'm also very resistant to attaching myself to any one way of expressing that spirituality in any like traditional sense. Like even down, like, of course, ists and isms, like I'm like yeah, hold on, I
Yep.
don't know if I'm this or I'm that. But not only that, but also even sometimes methods, like certain methods, I'm like, I don't know about that, I don't know how I feel about this, I don't know how I feel about that. And ultimately what it comes down to, and the question I'm trying to get to, is I think it's really easy, and I'm facing this right now because I told you before that I'm working on a video about spiritual influencers that really appeal to people's low-hanging fruit and the sort of vulnerabilities that human psychology has, like where
Yeah.
we all want to be venerated, we all want love, we all want status, we all want money. So you can just easily plug that hole with some esoteric words and some jargon the audience doesn't fully understand and some like weird technique, and then pretend that that's going to be a bridge to those desires that we all have. And it's really easy to take that apart. It's really easy to criticize and point fingers. But what's so much harder to do is to say, okay, what does valid and constructive spirituality without dogma actually look like? And that's a way fucking harder question. It's a way fucking harder question.
because it
but I know you
implies
have an answer. But I know you have an answer.
because it implies that if you actually knew that, you would do it.
Right.
Whereas when we don't know what to do, it's easier to judge and criticize than to humble ourselves at potentially failing by authentically trying.
Yeah.
And that, like, a frame that I really like is Ido Portal is
Mhm.
regarded as like one of the top movement experts in the world. And the way that he views his, expertise is that he wants to be a movement collector. Like what he does is he's always trying to seek new types of movement to explore, to do. And I copied him, and like the way that I think about my life is I want to be a story collector.
Mm.
Or from a Robert Anton Wilson angle, I want to be a reality tunnel collector. So to be a movement collector, you have to do the movements. To be a story collector, you have to live in the story. There's an idea that you earn the right to tell a story when you have truly heard the story.
Mm.
And so I think the I think the only authentic way is you pay attention to what you're inspired to try as a spiritual practice. And
I
then
like
you
that.
actually fucking do it. And then you just share your story of having done it. So you're not ever coming from a place of I'm done. Here is the only way up the mountain. It's no. I am a verbing thing. I'm listening to my intuition. And when I feel called to try something, I'm constantly honing how to do the movement. And then I just share my story about having done the movement. And it's like I love the Buckminster Fuller quote. And it's something along the lines of uh, the best way to replace a broken system is not to attack it, but to create a better alternative that eventually replaces it. And so, like, trust the part of you that is, triggered by the like empty, shallow, almost misleading spiritual influencer, but that let that trigger inspire you to genuinely try something and then just share the story. And like, that I think is really the only honest way to do it because anyone who's making YouTube videos, is still early in the process. And I mean that for me as well. Like any of us who are influencing in front of a camera, we're like, if there's a spectrum of a journey, we're still, in like stage like 2 of 8 or whatever. And that's dope because almost everyone in the world is between stages like 1 and 3, but that like the people who have the right to write the title that we see on most of
Mhm.
these YouTube videos, these motherfuckers aren't on YouTube.
Yeah. But I do want to say though, there is definitely a difference between people who are essentially saying, tap your forehead and think about piles of money and Lambos and pussy and like whatever, and really if you're not getting it, you're not doing it right. You like that's not the same as what you just said.
Yeah,
Like that, there's a big difference. There's a
yeah,
big difference. And maybe the difference is being on step 1.5 versus step 2, but there's some really really important distance there.
yeah. The one of the things that like effortlessly comes to mind for me that allows me to not ruminate when I see that or to like not have it eat me. And I'm not implying that you're ruminating or that it's eating you. I actually think that it's very good that you're honoring when you feel that someone is like violating human trust. Like I actually
Yeah.
think that that's good. But that like what effortlessly comes up for me as a story is God bless that person. if that person is at the point where they're making videos out of that, I truly believe that if my consciousness got to just look over their shoulder at their life, it would be a hellscape that I would never want to live in. Like, um, the other thing that I also trust is that anyone who earnestly attempts to like be in communion with the spiritual dimension of life, as long as they're earnest, they'll eventually find their way. And that they're going to learn through smashing their face into rocks
Yep.
when it's the wrong way. And so every single person who tries that head tapping to try to get a Lambo, they're going to smash into a rock, you know? And if they do get the Lambo, they're going to smash into a larger rock at a higher speed later.
Yes. Yeah.
And that there's, like, when I'm really in tune with myself, there's just this fundamental, like, it's okay. They're okay. I trust this whole thing, and that I trust that the best way that I can contribute to it is to be honest and compassionate and earnest and vulnerable and to create. And that, you know,
I
God
very
bless.
much, yeah, I very much resonate with that. And I used to have a very, and to an extent, I definitely have a very similar disposition as you. Like, and I actually say this at the beginning of this video, is that I I think people will figure it out. But if you find yourself in a position where you have an opportunity to intervene in a path that you're like, that I've been down that and it doesn't
Right.
go anywhere good, how do you skillfully, non-hierarchically redirect that energy into a more constructive direction? And that gets difficult. I think that question gets difficult because it does imply, like, look, I know I've been there, don't do it. And I don't particularly even think that works. I think people need to experience for themselves to really get it. But I do think there's a way that you can, like, have a softer landing. You know, you can have like a softer landing into understanding why that route doesn't go anywhere good. Um, have, and I know we've kind of shared some failings already in this podcast, or maybe that was before we recorded. We were talking about we should share some failings. But what was a path that you went down that you look back now and you're like, that was a waste of time? Like, I should not have even bothered.
So I think it's two different questions to
It
ask.
is, yeah.
Where have I failed? And then where did I think it was a waste of time? Because I think that I would have to actually switch into a disingenuous frame to claim that I feel like anything was a waste of time. And that it feels like, it for sure feels like a cliche when most of us hear people talk about, like, uh, you know, um, all of it helped lead you to the moment that you are at now, and that it's all good in some interesting way. But I think now that I've said that, the thing that comes to mind is I didn't know any better, but for, like, as soon as I started on this quote unquote path, and I think, you know, the most non pretentious way to articulate it is, as soon as I felt that I was making different choices than I used to make, and that the result of those choices was a more enjoyable, dope fucking life, what I did is I, almost like a missionary, I tried to go to the front door of my family and friends and tell them what to change so that they could be more like me. And so the way that that played out was when I first started to, like, change the way that I ate, because my entire life I ate bullshit and I had no idea what it felt like to eat healthy food and to not feel myself just completely bogged down by the bullshit processed food that I ate. And so when I was like 19 and I started to cut out like a lot of like processed carbs and like candy and soda and shit, whenever I would talk to my parents on the phone, I would, without realizing it, try to get them to change. And it got to the point where my mom texted me one day after I had talked to her on the phone, and she was like, I can't talk to you anymore because every time I do, I feel like you're judging me. And like, I don't feel good after we have talked. And I was crushing. And I got to the point where I started a blog and I started my podcast, and I would just share about the things that I was doing. And like 3 years after I got that text from my mom, I got a text from her again. And like we had like talked on the phone, but much less than we used to. But I got a text from her about 3 years later where she, out of the blue, said, I've been reading your posts and I've been listening to your podcast. I've started to walk 10 miles a day. And I'm off all of my medications and I've quit smoking. And I just started crying. And I was completely like, I had no idea any of that was happening. But in hindsight, what I realized was when you try to help someone in person, most of the time they will automatically feel defensive and they'll shut down, especially if they're your family or if they're like your intimate romantic partner. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I started to create art where they could come to it in the privacy of their own home without feeling like they were being judged, they were able to start to slowly do the things that I'd been trying to advocate to them. And, you know, it led to one of the most beautiful texts I've ever gotten from anyone in my life. And so I think one of the things that did not work was trying to tell people to their face how they were wrong.
Amazing answer. Amazing answer. And I think the reason that that worked long term, the big difference is like, you know what the inside out version of this is like you see someone who goes to a therapist or they work with a personal trainer and they'll do everything that person says because they've put themselves in the position where I approached you to get this answer and I will blindly go through the motions. But then guess what happens when they stop going? Falls apart completely. And I think what you were just describing was the opposite sort of relationship where your mother viewed you in this way, where she didn't view you as a person who had the ability to deliver this knowledge. So there was all this dissonance and potentially like resentment from you having the audacity to say this to your mother. But then when she, and this is the difference maker in both of those situations, whether you're going to the personal trainer or the therapist, or you're getting this information from a source that you don't feel like should have the authority to give it to you, the difference maker is you taking the authority from the inside out through like a integration process, and the integration has like yield, has like it like builds interest over time. You know, it's like an investment that you're making in yourself where you put yourself in your own place of authority and you don't even know how to do it at first. And then you slowly take authority, you slowly integrate it, you slowly try it, and maybe it takes years, but eventually you turn around, you're like, whoa, I've made progress, like through whatever things that may seem mundane, like quitting soda or going to the gym or whatever. But those are the building blocks of an actual better life that couldn't be more different from the forehead tapping bullshit. You know, they couldn't, and in my opinion, are far more spiritual. That's what I think people get fucked up about. And I get fucked up about it all the time, is we're like, wait, that doesn't sound very spiritual. You're just like going on the treadmill. You're just not drinking soda. It's like, yes, that is it. It's not like manifesting a fucking wallet full of Dogecoin.
So insight that I had like 2 weeks ago. So I've been working with a therapist for like 2 years, and I had an insight when I was speaking with him last week, and it's that deeply entrenched in Western culture is this idea of the magic bullet. And it is like the central myth to like Western medicine when it comes to um, like vaccines, and then when it comes to most psychiatric medication. What's super interesting is that the first scientific published paper that looked at the mechanism of why the first vaccine seemed to have an effect was a German researcher, and he referenced the phrase magic bullet. And I went and I looked up like where that phrase came from. And there's actually a German myth called Freischütz. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but I actually looked up how to pronounce it, so that might be right. But I fucking don't know how to spell it. But
You're not angry enough when you say it.
Oh, that was good. And the myth goes like this. There's a marksman who enters into a marksmanship competition to try to win the hand of marriage of a princess. And he loses. And he goes off into the woods forlorn and basically, asks for help. And foreshadowing here, a dark robed man comes and meets the marksman in the woods, and he gives him, I believe it's 6 bullets. And he tells him, I'll give you these 6 magical bullets, and they will always hit their mark, but I get to control where the last bullet will go. Do you want them? And Freischütz says yes. So he goes to the next competition, bullseye, 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 and he wins the princess's hand in marriage. But because of the fame, he goes to one more competition. He shoots the first 2, bullseye, bullseye. He shoots the last one. It goes through the heart of the princess and kills her. The end. That is the myth where we get the phrase magic bullet from. Magic bullet was a phrase that was in the first scientific paper exploring the mechanisms of vaccines. And then it's most of the first generation of psychiatric meds were serendipitous discoveries of people trying to make other vaccines, but they found that they had these interesting effects on people's psychologies. And so that's how we got the first wave of psychiatric meds, about 100 years ago.
Did you mean to say vaccines, or did you mean medicines?
No, vaccines.
Oh, really? So they're okay. Interesting.
Yeah. And so you fast forward to now, I think the magic bullet myth has it permeates New Age consciousness. And that most of us want to believe that if we do one acute action, that will heal everything, and that we don't have to change, we don't have to do any work. And I think that that's one of the core traps of our Western culture trying to understand the spiritual dimension of life. And that I think the alchemy to that myth is the story that most people have heard. And there was a monk who was seeking enlightenment, and and every day before he would sit down and contemplate, he would chop wood and carry water. He did that for 20 years, and he sat every day, and he eventually got to the point where he reached enlightenment. And the very next day, he chopped wood and carried water, chopped wood and carried water. And what I get from that is the real transformation will come from the daily, non-marketable, not a dope YouTube title for a video, chop wood, carry water. And so for me, it's journal and take a long walk outside. Journal, take a long walk outside.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think enlightenment is always a thing other people say about someone else.
Right.
Like if people look at someone and say, "Oh, they're enlightened," and then that person's like, "You're right, I'm fucking enlightened." They're not fucking enlightened.
Right.
And if and conversely, if they look at that person and say, "Oh, they're enlightened," and they say, "I'm not enlightened," they're still probably not enlightened, but they're more enlightened than they would be if they said otherwise. Like, like the Dalai Lama is a classic example. Like, he never says he's enlightened. He always just says he's just a guy, but everybody treats him like he's enlightened. And yeah, it's do you think, I don't know if we've ever talked about enlightenment specifically, but it's one of those words that's thrown around almost as haphazardly as like something like third eye.
Right.
Like I think that's probably like the most
Yeah.
mishandled thing. Everyone fucking ignore the name of my podcast and online presence. Um, it's a companion that I guess I've chosen, though I chose it in a very tongue in cheek way. Do you think enlightenment is can be resuscitated from the damage that's been done to it and all of the sort of magic bullet like attachments we
Yeah.
have to it? And if so, how, and how do you think of it?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, something that I've noticed in my life is that, like, in my process, I will every so often I will reclaim a word that I have killed when I heard it the first time. And that, to answer the first part of your question, it can be brought back to life, but it is an individual endeavor and it's for you. And so, because I grew up as a staunch atheist, there were many words that I killed outright before ever having actually explored them, and they were never alive in me. But over the course of the last 10 years, there's a few that I've brought back to life. And the big one is consciousness. I remember when I was like 20, 21, 22, 23, whenever I would hear that word, it meant nothing. I just could not understand what it meant. And now consciousness as a word is one of the most intimate words that is the most alive for me. And like for me, what consciousness is it's the most fundamental, raw aspect of my phenomenology of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tap into it right now and feel how alive that word is for me. Another word was dimensions. For a long time, that word didn't mean a goddamn thing to me. And now I have a deep living relationship with that word that is a lot like consciousness. Like I know what it means for me and it's fully alive. Enlightenment is an interesting one. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to play with like reappreciating the word without any of the cultural context. And if you think of the word enlightenment, you are enlightening, is what comes up for me. And I actually had almost like a dream like vision a while ago where it's like, it felt like I felt into the phenomenological force of what lightning is. And what I imagined is like, I imagined someone walking a piece of land at night where they can't see anything. And then lightning come like it starts in a cloud above their head and it goes out into the dark area in front of them and it briefly for a flashing moment illuminates the entire landscape in front of them. And that there's something about the illumination of what was previously in the shadow that's terrifying, but that is also awesome.
Yeah.
And that when I feel into that, enlightenment for me, it feels like it is a type of consciousness that is temporary.
Yep.
that the nature of all states of consciousness is that they are temporary, and that one can develop a set of practices to make that type of consciousness more frequent. I have never met anyone who lives in that space, but I feel like I've met many people who have had at least one moment, and that the way it feels for me, if I could be so audacious and bold to say that I've had moments of it, is it feels like I'm swept up temporarily without free will in the full stream of what the word grace feels like. Like it feels like I am in the stream of grace, and that there's a intuitive knowing of how to speak and how to move, what to say, when not to speak, when the right thing is to laugh. There's this overwhelming sense of a lack of ego, like a lack of Erickness. And it's just like I'm purely in almost
Yeah.
like a musical relationship with the environment that happens around me. I've never had it for more than a few hours. Um, I very frequently, most of the time, I don't have it without the help of, like ayahuasca or LSD or
Yes.
whatever, like if I'm just being honest. And that when I've had it, when I have not had exogenous chemicals, it's almost always I'm either alone or I'm with like one person and we've been away from everyone else and we've been like camping or something, where there's just a massive reduction in the external pressure to be a certain way. And that I think it's best understood as a type of music that can be played that is not under your command and does not stay.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I resonate with that completely. And I think that's a good instinct, that idea of the lightning bolt, because that's how it's depicted in like Vajrayana Buddhism. It's just, like, and that's kind of how Satori is talked about in general. It's like just this flash of, oh, yeah, you just suddenly get it. It's like a reorientation. And again, I just resonate with almost every single, I think with every single part of what you said, because totally the same. Like I've definitely been brought there more often through exogenous chemicals. But there's one time in particular, I was actually on my old college campus, and I just remember walking outside and just seeing people walking around, like going about their life, and just having the felt experience of the actual miraculousness that was happening in that moment. And it was like waking up within being awake already.
Yeah.
It's like another level of, in the way that you were completely in one phase of consciousness and then you woke up. It's like then you all of a sudden woke up to yet another phase of consciousness that's normally not accessible, where
Yeah.
everything felt just right. It's like everything right, it's just right. And it wasn't like an idea, it was like a
Right.
felt sense of I'm in it, just like you were saying about a relationship to music. Like I'm part of this musical thing. And it was weird, man. It almost what and there was a playfulness to it. Like
100%.
my reaction to it was laughing.
100%.
My reaction to it
100%.
was like, oh, oh, okay, yeah, oh yeah, 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 yeah. Like, and it was familiar. It wasn't in the same way like a psychedelic trip is familiar. When you finally get through the clouds and the atmosphere of like the come up, and you're like, maybe if you take psilocybin, you get a little bit nauseous, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm adjusting.
Yeah.
I'm getting I'm tuning the binoculars, and then you finally get there and you're like, whew, like that's what it feels like, but it feels instantaneous, and the half-life of it was very short.
one of the things that I really resonate with is that there is this intrinsic playfulness and just utter compassion, just complete, like, non-judgmental, completely unself-conscious, so easy to laugh, impossible to be triggered. And the other interesting thing is, like, I have no personal desire to, or I don't judge myself by not being in that state. There's a story that I really enjoy it goes something like, there was a monk who was trying to seek enlightenment, and he was in a cave, and he did the thing for like 20 years, and he finally got enlightenment. And then he felt the call to bring enlightenment back to the village he came from. He climbs down from the mountain. As he's walking towards the village, he can see that a parade is happening. He starts to enter into the crowd, and a drunk man accidentally steps on his foot. And he instinctually goes to raise his staff to hit the man. And then in shame, he goes back up into the mountain for the rest of his life. I see that as that's the trap of how most people seek enlightenment, which is, I'm going to remove myself from the game of life to try to get to this fragile state of peace, but that it doesn't transfer to being in the game of life. And that I think the aspiration, or just what feels fun and meaningful to me, is to be in the game of life, to be in the drunken parade, and to find pockets of remembering within that chaos. So that, like, one of the things I've really been feeling into recently is that the real gift that you give the world from quote unquote doing the work is the quality of your presence. And that through the way that you speak, through the words that you choose, through your posture, through how you react to people in certain ways, that the majority of what you are communicating about the quality of your life is unspoken and comes through, like, the tonality of your voice, the words you choose, the micro expressions that you have on your face when you do speak. And that the gift requires you to be in the presence of other people. And most other people are anxious, afraid, judgeful, resentful, and that there is something, like, one of the things that I have found is, it's like a huge part of what I do as a coach is really just to bear witness to people's anxiety and to remain calm. And that they share whatever it is that they share, and they can feel in me that there's no flinch. And a larger, more dramatic point is, and I think we've talked about this before, but throughout the course of my life, I've had 4 experiences where I've been in the presence of someone who would be labeled as going through a schizophrenic, psychotic moment. And what I have observed firsthand is that as they share their hallucinations, there's a part of them that knows that they're gripped by hallucinations, and they're expecting your judgment or your fear or your wanting to run away. And that actually is like throwing gasoline on the part of them that is trying to cope with their fear by retreating into their hallucinations. And that in all 4 experiences, what has organically happened is I've just sat with them and I've listened between 2 and 4 hours. And what has happened all 4 times is, through my not flinching and also genuine curiosity, they get to a point where there's just this, and they're out of it. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't pretend to understand what's going on there, but that it's happened to me 4 times now. And on some level, it feels like um, what's the right way to put this? It's almost like the purpose of my life is to cultivate, to be able to be in those moments in that way.
Hmm. Yeah. Perhaps by just being there unflinchingly, you serve as a sort of like mirror, and after enough time, the calmness of the mirror sort of just cancels out the mania or something.
Yeah.
It just sort of, I don't know. But yeah, I recall Jung saying something similar along the lines of he seemed to just have a general fascination with people who are going through that.
Yeah.
And I think the fascination for him stemmed from the fact that he saw this as like the sort of unconscious mind like seeping into the conscious mind or something
100%.
like that. Like the fears, the complexes, the subconscious, the collective unconscious, just sort of like a geyser like flowing out of someone because something was breached in the ego or damaged in the ego or something like that.
That's spot
It's
on.
like
Yeah.
leaking out of the persona. And I don't know, and like you, I don't know how to address that wound, but I think recognizing it as that makes it a lot less pathological and more, oh, you've just sprung a leak and there's nothing wrong with you. Like we got to get the leak under control, but you're fine. I think that's like the damaging part of pathology in general is that this practice of pasting a label over things works for insurance purposes, but it doesn't work for practical purposes. Like no one's ever, I mean, some people do seem to feel better when they get a diagnosis,
Right.
but
I think what's important to note is to steelman that point, because this is a thing that I contend with in myself when I critique aspects of like modern psychiatry that I really don't resonate with. But it's that the majority of people feel a incredible amount of peace once they get a name for it, because it validates that something has
yeah,
been happening that for them is real. The key here that I think is really important is that the naming of the constellation of symptoms does not equal a noun that is the result of your fundamental brokenness, and that it is just a description of a current state of out of tuneness, and that your birthright is to be tuned. And that in our current culture, most people equate a mental illness diagnosis as a noun that is unmovable, like type 1 diabetes. And I think that
right.
that is fundamentally untrue. And that so a really easy example is the symptom constellation of ADHD is a real experience that humans go through. This is, what I'm about to say is not my own opinion. I'm repeating what people who have studied ADHD their whole life have claimed, and there's many books on it. There is no gene that determines ADHD. ADHD is a learned behavior to adapt to a certain interpersonal relationship with your caretakers and the environment that you grew up in, and that it can be unlearned, and that there are multiple things that can exacerbate the human mind starting to have these symptoms, but that these symptoms are actually like, if you interpret the symptoms like they were signals of where you're out of alignment, that you could use them as like helpers to bring you back into alignment. And that there are some very good books out there specifically on ADHD, but I think it's fundamentally true, if I'm being bold and audacious, for every disorder that is in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. And I'll try not to get on my soapbox here, but if you actually look at the history of how the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual was created, you would very quickly lose the religious trust in that book. And that one of the things that I'm learning and why trauma is such an interesting area of study for me is that my deep intuition is that if we understood acute trauma and complex trauma, the DSM would be done. And that I actually read a quote in a book today. The book is called Complex PTSD by Pete Walker. But I actually just read this today. There's a quote by there's a quote on a leading psychologist who studies trauma, and I forget his name, that if complex PTSD was incorporated into the diagnostic and statistic manual, it would go from a thick book to a pamphlet.
Yeah.
And that most of our mental health disorders are a misunderstanding of the different ways that the human organism copes with trauma.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Have we talked about that book Pathological at all?
No, or at least not that I can remember.
I had this woman on who is the author of this book. She's a professor at Northwestern, but not in anything having to do with psychology. She just went through the psychiatry and mental health treatment system her whole life and had at times very severe, like self-harm, suicide, things like very, very serious mental health issues. Went through the battery of prescriptions, went through the battery of diagnoses until she herself started becoming obsessed with the history of what these terms are, what they mean. Is there any empirical basis for them? Things like, obviously, we've definitely talked about the chemical imbalance myth before for depression. And what she eventually figured out through talking to a lot of the psychiatrists who are in the business of helping to write these pathologies is that they're flimsy as fuck.
Yep.
Like it really just boils down to some dudes sitting in a room.
Yep.
And I'm not saying there's no merit to it.
No.
And that they're, obviously they're highly educated, but the problem is like jargon just builds on itself over time. And then you get this stack of jargon, and the stack of jargon is built on one flimsy idea after another to make it like a little bit less flimsy. But then it's like, are you really making it less flimsy, or are you just like building this fucking temple of jargon on top of a bunch of like flimsy foundations?
Yeah.
And it seems like the latter, though I totally, if I'm being honest, understand the need for doing something like this, because otherwise, like, how the fuck do you bill insurance? How the fuck
Right.
do you chart something? Like if you're a psychiatrist and you have like 20 patients a day, you don't have time to write like a philosophical Jungian dissertation on like whatever the person's going through. Unfortunately, you have to like chart it. You have to, and yeah, so, it's a problem.
Yeah, there's a few things here. One, it feels like one of the calls of my life is to try to bring a little bit more understanding to this, because like I love psychology, but if you look to physics, like one of the things that it is a sign that you fundamentally misunderstand something about the nature of the universe if it has to be complex. And that one of the things that they look for are elegant equations that are able to explain all these other observations. Yeah. But that if you have to have 400 different observations, but you have no thing in the core that explains why all of those would happen, it's actually a sign that you're fundamentally misunderstanding something. Mm-hmm. And it would be like if we were farmers and we saw that and we mapped out every way 100 different plants get sick, and we have a huge book about these are the plants that get sick. And so what we'll do is we'll inject some type of chlorophyll into this plant and then some other type of thing into this plant, but we're never looking at the carbon of the ground or the quality of the water
Yeah.
that goes into the ground. And that if we fixed the carbon profile in the soil and we fixed the quality of the water that went over the land, all of the plants would heal. And that my deep intuition is that if we developed a diagnostics like frame for understanding where people are at with their trauma, and that we develop protocols for healing trauma, we would see a revolution in psychiatry. But there's a momentum that is keeping that from happening because it would deeply disrupt the economics of the whole thing. And that it's a much larger story, and I won't jump on this soapbox, but the incentive structure of insurance companies and the incentive structures of psychiatrists in this generation of psychiatry is such where it's going to take at least a revolution in our story about the human mind that then leads to a generation of researchers who are brave enough to do new studies, but that I actually think it's happening. And I think that one of the most famous books in the like history of science is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And basically what he articulates in that book, he wrote it in the 50s, but he wrote down these stages a worldview has to go through in order to transform. And the punchline is that all the people who were the like torch carriers of the old worldview, they have to retire or die.
Yeah.
That they just won't change their minds. And yeah, I can feel my brain is wanting to go down multiple rabbit holes and stand on a bunch of soapboxes. And it's because I know that this is one of the things I'm the most passionate about trying to help. And, you know, it's probably why, you know, once I got still for 2 weeks, what came through was to write about trauma again.
Yeah. Makes sense, man. That really is what it all boils down to, because it's like being a human being is an inherently traumatic experience. And that doesn't mean you have to have been beaten into it within an inch of your life or raped or gone to war or whatever. Like, it's traumatic to be alive because we've all been vulnerable. We've all been scared. We've all been worried. We've all not known what to do. And all of that leads to certain coping mechanisms and a way of just getting through it, you know? And before you know it, you're unconsciously just repeating these coping mechanisms and doing these things in reaction to just living in a stressful, traumatic life, you know?
Yeah.
And that's something we all need to fucking make sense of. And what we call it doesn't fucking matter. The only words that matter are the ones that help us make sense of that process and take that process seriously. Other than that, you're just jerking off semantically, right? Like, it's like, who cares what we call it? It's like,
Yeah.
it's changing the raw experience of being alive and understanding your own mind better.
Yeah. And one of the
I'm with
things,
you.
so most like the reason you brought up like you don't have to have been like, you know, hit or raped or have gone to war is because most of us understand trauma as acute PTSD. And there's this other type of trauma that is currently called complex PTSD that has not been put into the diagnostic and statistic manual as a disorder. And that I think a more clear word for it would be like gradual interpersonal trauma. And what creates it is if you imagine that whenever you interact with someone, it's like you are playing a game And there's
Yeah.
actually a type of psychology that's called transactional psychology that's super interesting, that was created by a dude named Erick Byrne. And that when you engage in a game, let's say it's with your mom, and that the game was such that if you weren't able to make your mom laugh, you would experience pain anytime you interacted with your mom. You would very quickly learn over the course of 100 games, okay, I can't ever be upset. I can't ever be angry. And if I have any hope of wanting to feel okay in the presence of her, I have to learn how to be funny. And there's a bunch of different examples like this. But I think if you think of complex PTSD as gradual interpersonal trauma, we would be able to relax into the fact that we are all somewhere on that spectrum.
Yep.
And that one of the things that I was connecting to just today is that the only way that I'm going to be able to work through my gradual interpersonal trauma is that I have to actually do it privately. What I mean is that I'm not going to be able to talk about it on podcasts. I'm not going to be able to write about it in articles, because it's inherently triggering to the family that you grew up with. Like, one of the things that's really tough about this type of trauma that we all have is that if we're not grounded in ourselves and we begin to explore this, we will very likely develop tremendous resentment towards our parents. But then the other half of it is that our parents will feel defensive and angry and triggered. And one of the deep things to relax into, and I think Gabor Mate is one of the best public speakers on this, is that it's your relationship with your parent did not happen in a vacuum. Your relationship with your parent is embedded in our culture. And our culture has gotten to a place where it is tremendously hard to live the life of a parent and to be supported by your culture so you can actually be a parent. And that while your parents are trying to raise you, they're still trying to like find their happiness in life. They're still trying to find their place in their group that gives them a sense of home. Most of them don't even have communities. Most of them have to anxiously work at jobs that they hate in order to make just enough money to give you the things that you've been taught by culture to ask for. Yeah. So for every Christmas, you know that your kid is going to ask you for a fucking PlayStation or whatever it is. And that most of our parents, if they had anything going on with them, they were given drugs and they were given things to help, disassociate them from themselves. And so it's not their fault. But one of the really heavy things about this gradual interpersonal trauma is that in order to admit it to ourselves, we have to confront the profound grief that we actually have about the nature of the childhood that we got. And it's complex in the sense that the way this book opens up is it tells a story of the author when he was in his early 20s. He had been kicked out of his house. He had a very abusive childhood, and he was traveling through India, and he got to Calcutta. And like the day before, a massive flood happened at one of the neighboring villages, and 100,000 refugees came to Calcutta.
Wow.
And when he was going to his hotel at night, he saw the entire street, on the edges of both sides of that street, were these families sleeping. And when he went to bed that night, he was super anxious about having to wake up in the morning and see all the pain out there. He wakes up, he goes outside, he sees that the entire streets, each family used their blanket to make a small home. And people were like cooking small meals on their blanket. But what he saw that made him sick to his stomach was how happy they all were as families.
Wow.
That he just saw family after family of happy parents with children who are like crawling over them and making jokes and laughing. And their entire world was like 5 feet by 5 feet. And it made him sick because it was the first time in his life that he saw literally hundreds of examples of a type of family dynamic that he never experienced with his family and that he never even saw in anyone else's family. And that I think that something that's hard to connect to is that most of us who have grown up in Western culture, we haven't even seen examples of a truly happy family that's not traumatized by the expectations of how these parents ought to live. Like most of us live in nuclear families where we almost don't ever engage as a group with other families. And that there's a tremendous grief. And just one more example is I have a close friend who is the greatest living example I've ever seen of like a man who has chosen to be a dad. And I see the way that he interacts with his family. And it's like, I didn't even know that that was something that I could have even have had the audacity to hope for. And that there is something that actually happens in me that is grief when I witness that this is something that's actually possible. And yeah, so I guess I say all of that to say, I think all of us are somewhere on that gradual interpersonal trauma spectrum. And that what's really interesting, there's a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child. And it talks about, and this is something that Gabor Mate speaks about too, is that there are a set of genes that are correlated with being more sensitive to external energy, for lack of a more concrete word. Like if you are in the presence of a dysfunctional relationship, if you have any of these genes, you're more likely to have some type of mental illness. The way that that's been misunderstood is that these are the genes that cause mental illness.
Okay.
But what Gabor Mate is saying is there seems to be a evolutionary adaptation for a certain amount of each group to be more open to the energy of the group. And that like the cliche is that if those people were to grow up in like hunter and gatherer tribes, they would have been the shamans. They would have been the people who their whole life would have been to work with other people, to be able to feel their subconscious emotion so clearly that they would be able to almost like move it for them. But in our culture, those are the people most likely to like explode. Like if there's all this tension in the family, they're the ones who are most likely to get ill first. And so from that point of view, it's almost like the diagnostic and statistic manual is the book of how those type of people explode.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like doing a post-mortem, like forensic analysis with words or something on
Right.
people's behavior. Yeah. Damn. Yeah, those are powerful examples, man. And that's why I love you, Erick Godsey.
I love you too, man.
I love, I mean, sincerely, these 2 hours just fucking flew by, as they always do. And also, as always, I literally could talk to you for at least 2 more.
Yeah.
It would be a pleasure. And usually, and it's weird because like a lot of times at the end of a longer podcast, I'll be like, fuck, I got nothing else to say. I'm good to wrap up. But I lose myself in these mind melds with you, and I just love doing it. Oh, by the way, one of my patrons was like, you should make a little collection of your most downloaded episodes and like just post it. So I just wanted to let you know that I looked at the top 10 episodes and you're in 2 of them.
Hell yeah.
So yeah, people resonate. People resonate, brother. Anything you want to let people know about?
Yeah, I actually have an invitation for people. For Thanksgiving, try on actually making it a holiday again. And the thing that came through for me was to play the game that is called Four Givings. I'm going to say that again because I stuttered. Four Givings. And it's where instead of giving thanks, you actually take a moment to find 2 or 3 memories that you feel intense shame about, that you haven't forgiven yourself for. And then either forgive yourself through writing, you speaking this to your family when you guys sit down to eat. And if you want to do the more intense version, actually write them down and ask for forgiveness when you sit down to eat for Thanksgiving.
I love that. I love that.